wanted something useful and engaging for you to be involved with while these difficult times were going on. So we put this seminar series together. We've been running this for the last few months. We have one more exciting talk in June that we'll tell you about in a minute, and we're going to announce on LinkedIn the July schedule shortly. July will be the last month of the P.A.S.S program. Please make sure that you follow us on LinkedIn for these updates. Our next seminar is on June the 30th by Dr. Tip Meckel from the Texas Bureau of Economic Geology, and it's entitled Managing Industrial Carbon Dioxide Emissions with CCUS and 45Q Tax Credits. So before introducing Lanlan, I'd like to ask everyone to mute their microphones and turn off their video cameras so we have better bandwidth here. If for any reasons you have to leave this presentation, or if others wanted to join and were unable to, we are recording this. So Hamid, I assume you push the record button. And we have this and all the other talks in our series on our website. If you go under training, www.petrolern.com, Petrolern.com, go to training and you'll see an area where you can access all of these talks. A little bit about our speaker. I'm really pleased to introduce Lanlan. I've known her for, almost 20 years. When I ran geophysics at Shell in the Western Hemisphere and had staff in Venezuela, Canada, and the United States. Lanlan's been in the US for quite a while, but she was working up in Calgary at the time. So that's where I first met her. She has over 20 years of oil industry experience in unconventional and conventional reservoirs. She's worked as a geoscientist at Shell, Marathon, Statoil/Equinor, in senior technical positions and at service companies. Her focus has been on R&D, seismic interpretation, attribute analysis, petroleum geology, and oil and gas exploration. She also has very good skill sets in processing and imaging. She's particularly adept at technology integration and innovation. Lanlan holds a PhD in exploration geophysics from the University of Calgary, and she's currently discussing new job opportunities with E&P companies and technology companies. So if you or your company have an opening, I very strongly recommend Lanlan for consideration. And with that, if you have any questions, we have a little chat box, and we suggest that you type the question in during the talk, and at the end we will go back through the questions, and Lanlan will be able to answer however many she can in the time that's available. So with no further ado, Lanlan, it's all yours, and thank you for agreeing to be a speaker today.
Great, thank you, Alan. Thank you for the great opportunity offered by the Petrolern, the Technology Serum. So today I'm going to share some key learning from my research with Equinor. The topic is related to using seismic azimuthal anisotropy to characterizing the fractures and faults. So I'm going to share two case studies Equinor has been operated in US. One is from the Bakken, North Dakota. The second survey is from Eagle Ford. So this topic has been presented numerous times at external and internal conference. So 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, actually it's 2 years ago, I was luckily enough to be invited for a presentation at EAGE in Copenhagen. So the title seems to be a slightly different, but the technical content and theory are exactly the repeat from the EAGE conference. So at this point, because I have left Equinor, so the concern of the data and information confidentiality shouldn't be applied. So this is very clear. So since the topic is related to the faults, fractures, and I would like to basically give a very brief introductions about how we initiated this research project when I was with Equinor. So when we started this azimuthal anisotropy for faults and fractures, first of all, we went to the outcrops in Texas, and basically you can tell this is a configuration showing the on the outcrop showing the very fine sampled shells or mixed sandstone limestone interval, and cutting by the faults. And zoom in, you can see the faults is quite clear, and the width of the fault seems to be quite substantial. And nearby the hanging wall, we also see some microfractures. I'm not sure whether these fractures is related to what kind of organism, but in most of the case, the faults-induced natural fractures is quite common in the Eagle Ford. So after seeing these fractures and faults from the outcrops, we came back to the office trying to relate it to what we have observed in seismic data. So the big profile is showing is a co-rendering between the seismic section and some maps view. From the seismic profile, you can see those faults seems to be very nice represent complying with the geologies we have observed in the outcrops. And it's very interesting when we look at this scan, the faults from inline and crossline direction, and we find out some of the major regional faults are not purely aligned with a single orientation. So some is basically tilted, and some is basically approaching to the northwest-southeast orientation. And when you move a little bit further north, there are some basically completely opposite orientation of some small-scale natural fractures. Given this very complicated geological setting, and we started to think about utilizing the advanced technology, which is azimuthal information, to trying to make sure that we end up with an optimized azimuthal sector when we're analyzing this seismic data. So we believe no matter how complexity of these natural fractures has been oriented, once we defined with the azimuthal sector scheme with sufficient information, we even use a log information to try to narrow down the uncertainty. In that case, we believe the orientation of the subsurface geological feature should be illuminated by one of the orientation in the sector. So this is basically the very strong supporting point. And meanwhile, and since we started with this unconventional research project, I started to read a lot of papers. So one of the favorite paper published by Jamie Rick is what is the role of geophysics for unconventional shale plays? So from his paper, I basically summarize. For unconventional reservoir, it's a very fine scale, like a very thin beds, interbedding sandstone shells, and also some limestone dolomites interbedding. And also, because of the complexity, we need some multi-dimensional seismic attributes. These multi-dimensional seismic attributes, in my understanding, is that you're not only satisfied with the X, Y, Z offset, short domain offset. You should basically try to utilize whatever extra dimension, such as azimuth information, into your research. So that's basically another important point. And also, I have to point it out that this project is on the under the big envelope of the Equinor exploration strategic project. And under that project, we basically trying to understand what kind of the geological mechanism is going to control the well performance, the productivity. So whether it's a sweet spot from the reservoir characterization perspective, or it's from the hydraulic fractures basically the stimulation, or it's natural fractures because when you frack the rock, you basically taking the approach to evenly fracking at each stage. So is that a very financially or businessly optimized strategy or not? So we basically end up with a lot of questions trying to put that into together to start the research project. Okay, this is a little bit brief about this project. So as I said, I presented in the EAGE, I started with the introduction, why we need to do that, and followed by the workflow introduction of the Azimuthal Anisotropy, what the key core and technical content I have applied in this workflow, and shared the two major examples from North Dakota and South Texas targeting on the Austin Chalk and Eagle Ford interval. And basically getting very excited about the correlation between what we derived, the seismic anisotropy, with other data information. Because science is a science. Research can be very exciting. Even you correlated geology with the seismic data, you still want to integrate it as much information like the core measurement, FMI logs, and engineering production data, trying to make a good story to look at this seismic anomalies you derive from the wide-azimuth data is really correlated with FMI logs in terms of the fractures occurrence and the production data. Where the huge production flow is coming from, is from which stage. That stage is really nearby the natural fractures, or it's basically the huge production rate is completely resulted from the hydraulic fracture, etc. Okay, so this is all of the questions we need to answer from this project. I will wrap up with a conclusion. In terms of the introduction, the objectives of this study, and as Alan mentioned that I came from Calgary, I'm Canadian Chinese. I spent almost 65% of my career time at Shell Canada. So we basically did a lot of advanced technology sharing and that technology implementation. So after I left Shell Canada, I started as a geoscientist and attending the CSCG conference. So the top panel is showing a very interesting correlation between using wide-azimuth data to correlate it with the FMI logs. So this paper was presented by Lee Hunt from the 2012 CSCG conference. So the map view is showing the anisotropy from the amplitude signatures. And the horizontal wear path is showing the FMI logs. So when you see the hot spot, that is basically higher anisotropy. So after you have to grade it because these two data sets are related to, located in different scales. After you scale them up, basically scale down the logs measurement, scale up the seismic data, you got a very nice correlation. So this is FMI logs showing a good correlation on the cross section. So in the amplitude as a major signatures. And we also try using the travel time, basically using the velocity anisotropy, we end up with a very similar procedure. Very good correlation between FMI and seismic anisotropy from both amplitude and velocity information. So after looking at Lee Han's presentation, so at Equinor, I started to think whether we can apply the similar technology in one of the surveys, Bakken. This is a Bakken gather. So this is a target area showing the residual, sinusoid residue, which is basically the diagnosis of the HTI anisotropy, azimuthal anisotropy. This is a logs measurement from those three wells. So well B and C are showing very high frequency variant azimuthal anisotropy. So, and then we are trying to understand and whether the seismically observed anisotropy is basically aligned with the logs. And this is the zoom section. So this is target of the Three Forks. And this is a target of the Three Forks in the seismic data in the common offset gather. We see the sinusoid at that location. And the log is showing a very consistent phenomenon. So basically, based upon this very preliminary result, we basically think maybe we can spread out this information to look at the whole survey to basically check in the area we don't have the wells, what we derive anisotropy are they basically telling us a similar story about the natural fractures, etc. So this is a motivation of why we are doing this project. And technology roadmap is very straightforward. I divided this workflow into three core parts. We started with using the vendor-provided OBT PSTM migration. I have to point it out that for the unconventional shale plays, because of the margin has been very narrow, so for oil company, it's very rare that we send the data for the PSTM migration. So we do whatever we have. So this is a very important, right? Even there is some uncertainty regarding the time migration. It's also depend on the structure complexity in your area, right? For the Bakken and Eagle Ford, we received the OVT pre-stack time migration. So from the gather, we have to do a lot of data conditioning, like we do the offset binning and azimuth sorting. In that case, we are able to check whether in the gather, we would observe the sinusoid, which is a very typical diagnostic for the azimuthal anisotropy. And from the step one of the data conditioning, we will end up with what the optimized parameters. The two parameters will be the best offset cutoff value for different azimuths, and what is the best cutoff offset parameters for the isotropic case. So this is an example from the Bakken. This is one COP common offset vector gather. So the two panel, yellow, basically showing in the target area, shows in the sinusoid, very clear sinusoid, which is having the azimuthal anisotropy. Whether this azimuthal anisotropy is related by the natural fractures or not, we need to confirm that later by the data correlation. So with this example, we basically end up with that best offset cutoff value for the 5,000 feet for the isotropic scenario, because we make sure that at some cutoff value, offset is pretty flat. So this is isotropic case. When you go to the larger offset, you see the sinusoid phenomenon has coming into the offset. So we end up with the best cutoff value for different azimuthal sectors. And as I pointed out, when we divided this 360 degree, this is a Rose diagram, how you are going to divide your data into different offset sector. We also honor some data information from the geology. This is from the Bakken. This is a multi-caliper logs showing the stress orientation. So for the Bakken, we have two, the northeast, southwest, and northwest, southeast. So with this extra information being taken into account, we end up with this 8-sector scenario. So this is the data, the first step. Once we are happy with that, we basically did the azimuthal sector stack and trying to pick the horizon seismic interpretation along different sectors. So this is basically background is a Bakken and the top Three Forks base of the Three Forks. We focus on the Three Forks events. So as you can see, there are separation between these three curves. What these three curves separation means for, actually, the purple line is from the isotropic near offset stack. And the blue and green are basically from different azimuthal sector. So when you see the separation between these blue and green, they are basically luckily are perpendicular with each other. So separation occurs here and here and here and here. So even when you did the seismic interpretation visually, it's very hard to see any structure fluctuation, whether you can see the faults or folding. But from the seismic analysis using azimuthal anisotropy, basically you can get a very fine, small scale, this subtle separation. This separation is basically giving you information that velocity anisotropy. And after we finish this project, we know in this area, there are a lot of the lineaments and the lineaments, basically the faults or strike slip faults, and the throw is very subtle. So in that case, no wonder in the traditional seismic interpretation, it's very hard visually to see these faults. But using the extra dimensional azimuth information, we are able to see the separation of that. Okay, so that's basic. The first two slides is showing how we are doing the QC, right, on the first step, the data condition and diagnostic. So the next slides, I'm going to see how we are going to generate these attributes from these, whatever, the 8th sector, about how you did the azimuthal dependent offset stack, and it's a huge intensive seismic interpretation will be involved. And this is attribute derivation. So as I pointed out, I divided into 8 sectors, and sector 2 and sector 6, 5. This is from the same orientation because of the reciprocity. And we did analysis from these 4 basically major orientation. We find out the azimuthal sector 4 and 6 group in here seems to be illuminated features along the north, east, southwest orientation pretty well, if you see that features. And azimuthal sector 4 and 8, which is basically exactly opposite orientation, seems to illuminate the different features, which is along the northwest, southeast. And it's very interesting, a northeast, southwest orientation seems to be illuminated quite nicely when you compare to the other sector, like this sector 1 and 3, the data information or attribute anomaly seems to be not very substantial compared to the sector 2 and 4. So, and since we have a summer student working for me back to 2014-15, so we gave him a project to do a back-to-back comparison because I was focusing on the qualitative azimuthal anisotropy analysis. I gave him I said, could you please do some AVO inversion to try to see whether we are able to differentiate these faults, which we cannot visually see from the conventional seismic interpretation. And then this slide is basically, all of these faults are basically seismic interpretation. We derived, so along this orientation, you see a lot of multiple lines. Basically, that means from almost every sectors, we are able to pick that faults very clear, this orientation and that orientation. So the more redundancy in some seismic interpretation, the more confidence we will be build up for that. And it's very interesting, in one of the Strohback well, we have a microseismic data. It's showing a very similar pattern about what we have seen for the fault interpretation from the azimuthal anisotropy. So that's why I said the strong lineament trending, which is purple and blue, indicating the positive anisotropy. This is a very positive anisotropy. So the two major lineaments trending, northeast, southwest, and northwest, southeast. So basically it can be illuminated by this lineament interpretation. And one of the orientation from the northeast, which has been aligned with microseismic data. And this is also the after seismic inversion, we calculate the closest stress scalar and superimpose what we have been interpreted, lineaments trending along two orientation and with AVO inversion products. So we inverted velocity, density, VP, VS, and density. And from there, we are able to calculate this Young's module and Poisson's ratio. So the closest stress, CSS, is very similar to the Poisson's ratio. And sorry, this is animation, so that's why I couldn't, for some reason, I couldn't show that. What my intention was that this is a back-to-back comparison. The interpretation from the qualitative, which I have been doing, actually aligned with the inversion result. From inversion, basically these faults and lineaments, or we call strike slip faults, are actually correlated very well from the inversion results. So sorry, we couldn't do the animation for some reason. And the second survey I want to share is from the EagleFIRST 3D. And from the big survey, we have two survey I would like to touch. This EagleFIRST survey A has basically had the OBT pre-stack time migration results, which is the best results we can do the research. And the big survey we call a sugar merge. It's basically a 27 small survey merged together. A lot of wells have been drilled in that area by Equinor. And from survey A, you can see the data quality has been substantially variant. From the segment P1, 2, 3, the data is better. When you go to the further northeast, there are a lot of noise, and this is due to the seismic acquisition noise because we end up with the big lakes. So that's why for the survey A, I decided to focus on the study with only this fragment. As I pointed out, because this technology needs to choose the best parameters to do the azimuthal dependent near offset stack. So what I end up with, this is a Rose diagram showing, and the pink line is basically the best isotropic offset stack parameters. So we basically stack everything along the 360 degree, ignoring azimuthal contribution, basically just assuming it's a conventional isotropic. So we stack that, we call isotropic near offset stack as a benchmark for the reference. So for the azimuthal dependent near offset stack, we divide it into 8 sectors. So we stack from 0 to that offset information to stack them to generate the 8 subvolume. So azimuthal sector 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. So this is a QC showing that survey. So cross line, in line, showing the faults. So we purposely pick 2 horizons. The almost is at the shallow. The Austin Chalk and Eagle Ford is basically target zone. The reason why I pick is the almost is trying to test this workflow because the almost interval has shown a lot of faults, a thrust fault, the normal faults. This is graben. And I think the geologic complexity is really a good example, input information to test out the workflow. So the inline direction, this is a cross-line direction. So almost and the almost and Austin Chalk and Eagle Ford. And this is a map view. And let's take a look at the almost interval here. This is what we derived azimuthal anisotropy using the azimuthal sector 4. As I pointed out, we need to basically divide it, the whole 360 degree into the 8 sector. As you can see that as this is the map view showing the azimuthal anisotropy. You can see the high, strong anisotropy phenomena have been highlighted by the oval, yellow oval. We have the major faults coming through here, predominated by the northeast-southwest orientation. This is also the secondary small faults coming through here. And also we have the salt ridge coming through, which approaching to the other orientation. And I believe there's another fault coming through in this orientation, which is almost perpendicular to the regional faults. But from here, we wouldn't able to see that. Let's go to the other orientation. I'm sorry, because my PowerPoint presentation was initially made by the animation, but when I output this, for some reason, we couldn't see the animation. But I can basically verbally see if we only show the orientation of that using seismic data orientated by the azimuthal sector, this orientation. Those features, the faults definition are still there, but the other strong anomalies would be showing quite substantial different orientation. So the key point of using these 2 examples is showing you can basically ignore the azimuth orientation contribution to the subsurface features. But if you really know your target is very complex, it has faults, fractures, and some mixed conjugate faults being associated with, it's better to basically try to do a little bit diligent work. Divided your sector into different orientation, maybe just 2 orientation, northeast, southwest, northwest, southeast, to trying to compare how these geological features are differentiated from each other using different data sets illuminated by now. So that's a key point, right? So they basically, after we finish all of this attribute generation, we want to validate what we have derived by integrating the regional geology, such as regional geology mapping by North Dakota, and we have the microseismic data, as I pointed out in the early slides. And for the production data for the Eagle Ford, it's very luckily we have the production data, PLT data. We have FMI logs and showing the natural fractures occurrence. So in each stage, how many hairs is showing how many natural fractures have been counted. So in that case, we need to validate that. And this is a big survey, and I want to basically compare the slides between my azimuthal anisotropy through the animation. but unfortunately we cannot do that here. This is my fault. And the key point of showing this is that you can see from the Azimuthal Anisotropy, even using this big merge, even we don't have the azimuth information because the data was not processed by the OBT-PSTI migration. And after the merge, they just run conventional isotope time processing. Given this data, I have to do the modification for my workflow because my workflow was purely rely on azimuth information in the trace header. So we can still do approximation. So from these slides, you can see the regional faults is coming through very nicely. So it's approaching to the northeast, southwest, very, very nice fault definition. And also in this area, we have an arc, basically the arc configuration. And this fault is a little bit deviated from these trending faults. So that's why I pointed out earlier that because of the orientation, the variation of the azimuth orientation of the faults. So it's better if you have data to be able to carry all of this azimuth information in the processing. It's very wise and worthwhile to look at the data in different orientation. Okay, so this is one of the favorite slides I would like to share. So this is a zoom section, and we have drilled 2 wells. In the old wells, the horizontal wells. This is a hill, this is a toe. And this well is here, toe is here. So I use a black arrow pointing from the hill to the toe. So these 2 wells were drilled a couple of years ago by Equinor. And the initial plan of these 2 wells were targeting on a deeper Eagle Ford target. But for some reason, due to the operation procedures, and we couldn't land in the well completely in the Eagle Ford. So pretty much of the length, the drilling length were targeting on the Austin Chalk, basically just above the Eagle Ford. They are not separated with each other. And it's very interesting when we plot the production rate. And the dashed line are basically the production because it's a pad. So we have the well from the same pads, and targeting on the Eagle Ford. And these 2 wells are basically targeting on the Austin Chalk. Compare the production, normalized production flow, and we'll find out the solid line are basically a better well performance from the Austin Chalk. And why and how? Because only partial of the well length or well path have been landed in the Austin Chalk. And it's very interesting, we got a better production flow. So given this very limited data information, we started to think about the natural fractures contribution of the production rate. So with all of this information, we drilled a new well a couple of years ago, solely targeting on the Austin Chalk. So this is basically the well path. Not too far away from here. It's very interesting, the orientation, the orientation of the horizontal well is not always the north-south, right? It depends on how we have the axis of the land, right? So for this new well, we started from here, and this is here, this is a toe. And we find out because the good production well from this older well, it seems to be correlated with a high anisotropy, highlighted by the yellow and green. So it's basically repeated what we have observed from this older well. So that's why before the well has been drilled, and as said, it's very interesting. We have the similar pattern coming through. If nothing happened in terms of the operation excellence, we should be able to get a good production flow as good as these 2 wells. So what's the story? After we spot the well and finish the log measurement and get the PLT data collected, so we find out this is a well path. So I circled with a high anisotropy and also superimposed the FMI logs along the wear path. So we've seen a lot of very busy here and accountable natural fractures occurred along the wear path. And even the high frequency of the FMI log is not 100% coincident with anisotropy. But if you look at these two circles, it's basically very correlated very well with azimuthal anisotropy, right? Even the azimuthal anisotropy is still based upon the seismic scale. Basically, it's a low frequency, and the FMI log is high frequency, right? Wait a minute, we have a PAT data set. We want to take a second call, how the production data, PLT production data is telling us, and basically superimpose the PLT data chart. And the red segment are the higher PLT productions. It's very interesting. These two longer red segments are higher PLT production data. It's correlated with my anisotropy very nicely. So what I'm saying here, when you land in the horizontal well, basically you frac at each stage. Not every stage is contributing to the good production flow. So this is basically brought up the question. If you know your seismic data is telling you in some area, this is high anisotropy phenomena is showing the suspicion of something, then are you still going to frack in that area evenly with other stage which didn't show the seismic anisotropy? So from this eagle, for example, basically, it's telling us a very good encouraging alignment. At least on this path, I would say this technology should be very promising and to trying to correlate it with other data information to understand what are the major geological control is determining the good production flow in the wear performance. So that's why after production data, a PLT data was provided to us. We did a correlation. We showed the asset team, and we asked how the production flow on the daily base from this new well. And the production geologist was sharing very briefly said, actually for this new well, the production well performance is way more better than what we initially anticipated. So this is a very comfort comments which paying back what we have implemented from the research perspective. Okay, so the last slides, two slides I would like to share is that for the same Eagle Ford data, even I modified the workflow trying to make it happen working for these 27 small survey merging together. I would like to compare what this anisotropy is revealing the geological features when we compare from other methods like a diffraction image. If you are a geophysicist, and diffraction imaging has to be very popular in the past 10 years because diffraction imaging is using the diffraction energy instead of the refraction information, right? So these two slides is basically showing the comparison. This is my azimuthal anisotropy derived from the base of the Eagle Ford. So the red arrow is pointing to the regional faults, north, northeast, southwest trending faults, regional faults. So anisotropy is giving a very nice fault definition. It's very thin scale, fine scale, right? So you can see a lot of faults coming through here. And also did some interpretation in terms of other geological features. If you take a look at that, we see these diamond-shaped features. So actually this is a polygonal faults, right? The polygonal faults is basically randomly distributed. It's repeated here. It's quite different features from these regional faults. And 2012, and the leading edge, my old colleague Michael from the Marathon, he was using the diffraction energy and trying to working on the same data sets. So diffraction imaging, in theory, diffraction energy should be very sensitive to the disconnection, right? In terms of faults, interpretation, or illumination. And diffraction imaging should be way more better superior to using the reflection information as the input data. So it's very interesting. When I found this first paper, I basically dumped this paper and did a comparison. So this is the seismic anisotropy from my workflow. This is a diffraction imaging. I think in terms of the polygonal faults, the diffraction imaging is doing a very nice job here. But in terms of the very fine sampled seismic interpretation on the faults, regional faults, I think my approach is provided way more sharper definition. Okay, so I think the wrap up with a conclusion. As I pointed out that this workflow has been tested by 2 data sets from Equinor operating area. So our understanding and experience, we found the data, the workflow is very robust and it's pretty effective and easy for implementation. So the derived azimuth anisotropy anomaly have a great potential for mapping the regional faults accurately, as we pointed out from the last slides for Eagle Ford, and also defining the potential fracture swarm nearby faults or fractures. I think this should be referred to the small Eagle Ford survey, because nearby the faults, we've seen a lot of fracture induced, the faults induce the fracture swarm. So those strong anomalies are pretty much a representation of the fracture swarm instead of the single fractures, right? So we can relate the identified azimuth anisotropy to the imbalanced stress field. So as I pointed out, if you remember in the early slides in the Bakken, we use the multi-arm caliper logs to basically trying to understand the stress orientation. In the Bakken, we have 2 major predominant orientation, northwest, southeast, and northeast, southwest. So, so if we look at the seismic azimuth anisotropy from seismic data, this is an observation. So what kind of the geological mechanism is potentially causing to the seismic azimuth anisotropy to be recorded in the data? So they basically putting into 2 categories. One is an imbalanced stress field. So if the local stress field is not balanced, one orientation is way more larger than other orientation, then seismic azimuth anisotropy could be easily recorded. The second is basically the natural fractures. And sometimes the orientation of the natural fractures seems to be aligned with the regional stress orientation. So, and sometimes they are not. So in that case, we have to rely on a lot of data information to trying to make a good correlation, to make a good story, to convincing what we have derived the seismic azimuth anisotropy is really represent the geology, like the anisotropy, the fractures and faults. So this is, we need a lot of data information to go into that analysis. So for azimuth anisotropy interpreted from the Bakken 3D, we align with the understood stress orientation, northeast, southwest, and that orientation is also aligned, confirmed from the microseismic data. So our pilot studies from the Eagle Ford surveys has demonstrated a good success of utilizing azimuth anisotropy to delineate the faults and the fracture system. And it's very interesting and very excitingly, the production data from Austin Chalk, the new well, it show a very encouraging correlation between the azimuth anisotropy phenomena and wear performance locally. So this is a very encouraging and promising correlation. We end up with the Austin Chalk well, the new well we drilled 2 years ago. So I think this is all I would like to share. And because of the slides, PowerPoint slides, some hiccups, so I couldn't do a lot of animation. But I think the key message should be verbally explained, clear, I believe. So yeah, I think that's all. This is all I want to share. And so I leave some time for QA and QC. We still have 12 minutes. for question if you have.
Hey, Lanlan,
Okay.
that was an excellent talk. It's Alan, and I want to thank you very much. There are a few questions that came in. Some of them are a little involved. I'm going to let some of the speakers, some of the people who listed the questions, ask the questions here to ask them. Let me go towards the end. Tim Wong says, thank you for the nice presentation. The Bakken is an oil play. Equinor's Eagle Ford Survey A is rather gassy, whereas Survey B spans a few fluid type windows. Did you see any impact from the fluid?
For the Eagle Ford, right?
Yes.
Okay, yes, and actually, this is a great question. Austin Chalk is actually the mixed phase, even it's in gas window, right? So we know in the Eagle Ford, it's a condensate, right? But Equinor has a very clear business strategy. We are not interested that much in the gas, right? We are more interested in the liquid. So for the production rate for the both Eagle Ford and Austin Chalk well, we basically it's oil show. It's actually the oil show. It also depends on the depth of the well, right? Even it's the same target, and Eagle Ford is a very spread out in geography, and the depth has been actually, if you go to the northeast, the depth of the same unit is actually shallow than the depth in the southwest area. So I think my answer is that this is an oil show instead of the gas show. Did I answer your question?
I think the question might have been, if you're trying to make measures of anisotropy, and we'll get to Colin's questions in a minute. For the moment, you're assuming this is all HTI. Do you see any differences in the amount of anisotropy when you're in the gas window versus when you're in the oil window?
That's really that's a really good question. I didn't pay attention.
If I have this wrong, Tim, then you ask the question. But that's my understanding of your question.
Yeah, I don't think the anisotropy difference, the magnitude difference would be dependent on the hydrocarbon phase. So in this particular case, I believe this anisotropy would be pretty much induced by the fractures or fault-induced natural fractures. So I think it's basically whether these fractures, because we see the oil show, right? So it's basically, it's an opened natural fractures instead of the calcite fill-in, right? If it's calcite fill-in, it's not opened. So I don't think the hydrocarbon, the liquid, the phase would be impact the anisotropy variation. This is my answer. Maybe I'm wrong.
Colin has a few questions. I'll just tee this up. You're making an assumption here, and you're looking specifically at HTI.
Yes.
But in some reservoirs, the VTI, the vertical, or the TTI, the tilted, can be greater than the azimuthal component. So Colin, why don't you go ahead and unmute and ask your questions yourself?
Sure, yeah. Please, Colin.
Okay, I just figured out how to unmute myself. So thank you very much for your talk. Very nice. So my first question really was about the HTI assumption. In most unconventionals, you know, we have clay, kerogen, etc. We tend to have a strong VTI or TTI component due to the lamination, etc. And so, you know, what we found was that HTI is a poor assumption, and actually, I think the minimum reasonable assumption is monoclinic. The reason is that you can also have multiple fracture sets, and we found cases that where you know, the most heavily fractured zones can have the least azimuthal anisotropy. So, for example, imagine two orthogonal fracture sets with equal numbers of fractures. Then that would have low azimuthal anisotropy, but would be the most fractured interval. and we developed a method for determining fracture density when the azimuthal AVAZ is actually small. So that was one of my questions, and then another question was.
Wait a minute, Colin. I'm sorry, because I'm remembering my terminology. How many elastic moduli, therefore, do we need for a monoclinic system?
Well, you need quite a few, but you only need a limited number of combinations to understand AVAZ, and if you couple that with a well-based rock physics model, then you can use the rock physics model to fill in all the others. Okay. But the AVAZ certainly gives you enough information for correlating with production, etc. But as I say, you may get better production from a low azimuthal anisotropy zone because there may be multiple fracture sets.
Colin, I think I love this question. So actually, when I was in Calgary, we end up with a similar question when I was doing the technical service as a geoscientist. And some good production well is coming from the smaller anisotropy, as you said, because it's conjugated natural fracture oriented. So azimuthal anisotropy has been canceled out, right? So I think you gave a good example of the specific geological features. But for the Bakken and Eagle Furs, we know the regional stress, we know the regional faults orientation. I think maybe these are a simpler natural fractures here is pretty much, I would say, mostly induced by the faults. Because the orientation is very simple, right? So that's why the higher anisotropy, a little bit higher or medium value of anisotropy from that simple geology should give the higher production rate. Is that making sense? I think that.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. And if I could rephrase your answer in a different way, it's essential in using these products to combine them with geological knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And my last question, it became topical, I think, after last year's SEG. Did you make any correction for the effects of overburden complexity on AVAZ? Because, if variations in the overburden can look like AVAZ at the reservoir level, but are due to ray path effects. So did you make any corrections for overburden effects?
Actually, this is a very good question, Colin. I like it. And I have to point it out, the slides I'm sharing here is based on the travel time. It's a velocity VVAZ, velocity anisotropy. And when I did a QC, and for example, one of the small survey, here, let's look at this chart. And the reason I picked the almost, because this geologic complexity is very substantial, right? We use this horizon as a benchmark to test the workflow. When you go to the deeper section, like Eagle Fur, Base Eagle Fur and Austin Chalk, they are very thin together. So we look at the anisotropy as the magnitude difference of azimuthal anisotropy between the almost and the deeper section. We didn't find the anisotropy from the overburden has been severely impacted in the underlying events. So that's why this is a mystery. I would like to, in theory, I understand what you mean. And the approach I have been applied or initiated seems to have the least overburden impact. And also when this is a Eagle Fur survey, and when we go to the same survey, when we go to the shallow, I didn't prepare the slides, maybe we can communicate offline. And when you go to the shallow, not shallow as a near surface, actually these should be 200 meters underneath the near surface zone. I did a QC, I did a lot of QC. The sinusoid curve is a very substantial. So in that case, I would say the anisotropy, azimuthal anisotropy derived using the seismic data, is a geology dependent locally. It's related to the local geology, right? So those impact in this particular approach has not been deteriorated the underlying reservoir target.
Okay, I'm going to go through two other questions here in the interest of time. Gabriel Perez is asking, I think it has to do with looking at velocity anisotropy versus amplitude anisotropy. Is your target interval thick enough for the says for the travel time signature of anisotropy to be detectable? And if not, how about using amplitudes?
This is a smart question. For this particular case, the reservoir interval is thicker enough, and we would be able to differentiate the azimuth anisotropy from the base and top. Yes. And in terms of the amplitude, using amplitude anisotropy, I didn't put a lot of, this is a little bit, this is because I mentioned this is a technology confidentiality involved.
Yeah.
Before I left Equinor, I can verbally say something. And because travel time base I've presented in the EAGE, so there's no problem of that, right? So amplitude information, Colleen, you might remember the Heloise Lin, she presented a couple of papers in the SCG using the amplitude, the azimuth dependent near offset information of the amplitude to basically trying to point it out that this anisotropy might be linked to the fracture porosity. And in the past 10 years, we talk a lot about the fracture intensity. Intensity is how much. And porosity might be related to whether this fracture is opened or it's filled. So I do have some slides, but I'm not allowed to show here. So fracture using amplitude anisotropy in this workflow, I got a very, very interesting result aligned with the velocity anisotropy. So in that case, it can only give me confidence that strong anisotropy anomalous is showing in that region. We have a lot of natural fractures, and those natural fractures are seems to be opened.
Okay, there's a question from Rezang. I don't know what your experience is, Lanlan, using multi-component seismic. We were looking at compressional waves only here, I believe. He asks, what would multi-component seismic contribute to the study or contribute to unconventionals in general?
This is a very good question. I can briefly touch that. When I was working with the Marathon Oil for 2 years, I was involved with the multi-component 3D acquisition for the Canadian oil sand, which was owned by the Marathon. And we sent the data to the CGG for the processing and parallel VP and VS processing. And it's actually very interesting. The shear wave data is showing in some area complex geology. So it's showing a lot more sharper in terms of the reservoir the configuration. So that's why I think if we have the shear wave data for the unconventional reservoir, if the reservoir geology, if the subsurface geology is basically, if we know, we have now a lot of knowledge about the regional geology. If we had natural fractures, so the shear wave splitting for multi-component should be provided a much nicer or more convincing data point to go with the P wave data. So that would be lovely. We can have both to increase our confidence about where the anisotropy has been located and correlated with the logs, and to trying to end up with a better understanding in geology. Yes.
Another quick question from me. I think somewhere along the line when you were talking about Poisson's ratio and so on,
Yes.
You had to come up with a density estimate. How good is that? Do you compare it against well logs and so on?
I think that after we, this is a very good question. We invert VPVS from the Bakken data and also invert the density. Okay, this is a very good for these slides, and we have this. Can you see the slide, the closure stress scalar analysis?
Yeah,
this
yeah,
slide?
yeah.
I think the well, for that well, I think it's this well. And it's basically density is showing very interesting phenomena. We have the well, it's a pad targeting on both Three Forks and Bakken. And this slide is showing from the Three Fork, which is underneath the Bakken. And the density is showing what do you see? That density is showing high, and instead of showing low, and that high density is actually not. It's from. I suddenly forgot the terminology. Anhydride. This is an anhydride. So anhydride, it's because it's not reservoir, it's a high density, and from the Three Forks, and from this along the same path, and the middle Bakken is showing H2S. So for the middle Bakken, we know the reservoir never have the H2S because we don't touch the drilling has never showing any anhydride or H2S related. So that's why we end up with a scenario or analog that this H2S is a product of the anhydride with H2O, with water, like a chemistry equation, right?
Yeah.
And this anhydride is basically a resource for the H2S, and it's basically flow upward from the Three Forks into the middle Bakken interval and through the natural fractures or faults. I suddenly recall that story. Yeah, it's a little bit offline. Yes, so yeah, density is, that's also a very good question. The density is showing, because we have three wells here in this chart, the density is showing pretty good correlation between the well information and the AVO inversion. Yes.
Thank you. Hey, I want to thank Lanlan and all the participants today. Our next seminar is on June the 30th, a week from now. And Dr. Chip Meckel from the Texas Bureau of Economic Geology will be talking on managing industrial carbon dioxide emissions with CCUS and 45Q tax credits. May you all have a safe week, and thank you for your attention. And thanks so much, Lanlan, for the great talk.
Thank you so much for opportunity, and we're hoping that to.
So this one will be recorded. It has been recorded, I'm sorry, and you can find it on our website, www.petrolern.com, along with the other 21 seminars that were given. Just go to the training section and it'll be easy to find. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.